I really didn't want to do this today. I was hoping to make this a high production value affair. But in terms of everyone's schedules and my own non-existent budget, it just didn't work out. In the end, I've really been wanting to make this video, but I also really want to be done with it, because when I started making a video diary of my transition, my intention was, and still is, to make a record of the process and really to look forward. At the time of this recording, it's been 7 months that I've been on hormone replacement therapy, and it's been easily the best decision I've ever made. And because of that, I've really wanted to focus on the positive, and I still do. At the same time, though, I've been trying to think what less common perspective I can offer that might actually be useful. What could I have to say that hasn't been said 100 times by people with more pleasant voices and better production values? This line of thinking kept bringing me back to one thing. I keep seeing people, gender criticals, TERFs, warning about the permanence of medical transitioning. But the thing that I know, the experience that I have, is what happens when you don't. What this thing can do to your life without you even knowing what it is. Inaction is not benign here. If you're ever talking to someone who asks, what's the harm in waiting? Or why can't you just be a feminine boy or a masculine girl? I really hope this provides an answer to that question. This video is about what undiagnosed gender dysphoria did to my life and to the people around me. This is, of course, just my own experience. Everyone's experience of things is and will be different, and I in no way intend to speak for anyone else. In the same vein, I am obviously not a mental health professional, and this is not intended as any kind of advice, right? Everyone's journey is their own, and only you know yourself. I hope this is the only video I have to make that isn't positive or at least a little fun, but it felt too important, honestly. As you can imagine, and as at least a few people probably watching this video will recall firsthand, the effects were not great. So, content warnings for self-harm and just a whole host of mental health issues generally. While I will be referring to some real-world events, I will, of course, not be naming names, and I will keep things as vague as possible, just out of respect for the privacy of everyone involved and the people that I've hurt. I won't pretend to remember this, but by all accounts, I was a stupidly happy kid. Excited about everything, loved running along the beach and reading stories. Even then, I was friends with a lot of both boys and girls, and never felt out of place, really. Maybe this is because my mother never forced me into stereotypical activities, and maybe it's because in Maine, growing up, we did a lot of outdoorsy stuff, where gender lines weren't stark when they existed at all. It's hard to say. What's less hard to say is that puberty utterly crushed this. Adolescence sucks for everyone, though, is what everyone said. So I assumed that what I was going through was the same thing. Everyone felt wrong. Everyone felt their body become less and less their own. At the very beginning of all this, I had this impulse to escape my body. And I nearly ended things when I was 13 or 14. I'm not quite sure. Fortunately, the impulse scared me so much that I told my parents and was put into therapy pretty much immediately, where I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I wouldn't question this diagnosis for about 30 years. Now, I don't blame anyone for this. Everyone involved, my therapist, my mother, even most of my teachers, did the best with the information they had. None of us, least of all me, had the vocabulary to properly articulate what was happening to me. The only thing I knew is that I felt wrong. The world felt wrong. And the more time passed, the more wrong everything felt. Throughout this period, I tried a number of different antidepressants. Prozac, Zoloft, even Celexa at one point, which they told me is an antipsychotic. None of them helped. And most of them just made things worse, which in retrospect makes sense. The depression was a symptom, not the disease. Now, I'm glossing over a lot here, but the next few years marked an increasing retreat into school and fantasy. Going to college for fiction writing effectively combined these, and I spent all of my time in stories. Whether in what I was reading or writing or the games I was playing, I got around how wrong I felt basically by existing as an actual human person as little as possible, especially in college, which of course means I didn't really learn how to function socially at all. And of course, this couldn't last. Near the end of college, I started dating someone. And the carefully constructed bubble I had erected to protect myself came into very ugly contact with reality. All of the insecurity, the self-doubt, the ugly feeling that I was wrong in some way became unavoidable. I won't go into detail, but I will never regret anything more than I do the hurt I caused her. My idea of who I was, the thing I told myself I was in private, alone in my dorm, hadn't survived contact with reality, and the next year and change were this slow motion collapse into depression. Not only did I have to confront all of the disgust with myself and the dissociation I had been ignoring for years, but stacked on top of all of this was the harm I'd done to someone I believed that I loved, and it broke me. Eventually, I found myself lying on a twin mattress, staring at a ceiling, having not eaten for a couple of days. A very dear friend had to drag me out, feed me, and take me to the hospital. She almost certainly saved my life. Now, you might be thinking at this point, hey, what does any of this have to do with gender? This is just an introverted, sad person making incredibly bad choices. And yeah, this is kind of the point. One of the hardest things about this is the way it manifests, or manifested for me at least, was in terrible life decisions as secondary effects of doubt, of self-loathing, and the pervasive dread, which are themselves the very direct results of gender dysphoria. It bleeds into everything. But I survived that, obviously. Moved back home, got a job, a car, my own place, and most importantly, I had a plan. I might have just gone right through the gifted kid to utter burnout pipeline, but I was still smart. I solved problems. I became convinced that I could think my way through this, control my responses, shield everyone from the consequences of what I still believed was my illness. I didn't have the money for therapy or medicine, so this was very much a DIY endeavor. Instead, I developed a system. Any strong emotional response I felt, before I allowed myself to react, I made myself stop. Analyze it, find a cause. If it wasn't real, meaning if I couldn't find a cause from what was happening around me, I decided it was part of my disease and not real. An emotional hallucination. I would isolate myself, wait things out, compartmentalize. Ooh, I got good at that. By discounting these emotions as fake, I protected myself from ever having to consider them any further. Thing is, I was even proud of this system I'd created, like I'd outsmarted my own brain. And it worked. End of video. I mean, it worked, sort of. I was functional, writing again, earning decent money, dating, found new people. Found new people that I loved like family. I thought I'd learned to live with this illness I had, how to protect people from it, while still having a life. I thought I had my life, myself, figured out. Now, none of this did anything about that feeling, that pervasive feeling that everything was just a little bit wrong. It was an itch that I couldn't scratch, but that didn't stop me from trying. There had to be a person who could make me feel right, a place where I belonged more. There had to be something I could do about this. This kept me in constant flux, always looking for a new partner, a new place, a new hobby, or achievement, which in some ways was good, but in most ways pretty destructive. Before I moved to Chicago, a friend said something to me along the lines of, "You're still going to be you out there." She knew that moving wasn't going to fix whatever was missing. I told her that I knew, but I had to try anyway. The problem with all of this is the same as the problem with repressing anything. It doesn't really address the problem, and it is, at best, a desperately fragile solution, easily broken down by a few bad days. A breakup and a global financial crisis later, I felt like I was back where I started, but 6 years older. All the progress reset. Still a broken mess. Still fighting the same battle. It's kind of odd the way something can be both the best and the worst at the same time. Giving up is, in its own way, kind of liberating. I tried to manage my life and my condition on my own. I tried to do everything that I thought I was supposed to do, and it blew up in my face. It's hard to express just how tired I felt after all those years. And at that point I figured, fuck it, may as well have what fun I could. So I made sure I had no free time to think. Every day became work, party, sleep for 4 hours, repeat. The thing about Chicago, at least when I was there, was that if you want to see live music or you want to go to a party, there is almost always something happening on any given night. It is the perfect environment if you want to run away from yourself. I called it culture and socializing and whatever else, but really, I just hoped that if I kept busy enough, occupied enough by music and people and drinking and writing, if I just never left my brain alone, I could keep all of those feelings at bay. And as before, it kind of worked. Life is full of half-assed solutions, and for a while, years even, this was fun. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like I was fighting a losing battle. I was just enjoying myself. I'm sure you can guess where this is going, because behind that, all of that old self-loathing just kind of rotted. Right? It poisoned friendships and relationships. And on top of that, the thing about hormones is they never stop working. Testosterone just kept doing its damage. My facial hair got thicker. I started growing more body hair. My already fairly deep voice got lower. My hairline receded to where you can see it now, or under there. And all of it just disgusted me. I wanted to crawl out of my own skin, and I took out that disgust on my body. Sometimes I'd tear out chest hair in clumps. Sometimes it was worse. I still have some of the scars. But I never let myself think about it. Told myself it was just the depression that I just had to push through. Worse, though, really, was the way I put my problems on others without realizing that that was what I was doing. I couldn't love myself, which just made women's interest in me intoxicating. If they could see something in me, maybe I wasn't entirely worthless, even if I couldn't see it in myself. Most of the women I dated during this time, I don't think I even had genuine interest in. I just needed the continued validation that maybe, possibly, I could be worth loving. When the company that I worked for was sold and my job was about to be eliminated, everything had to change again. And the more I sat with it, really thinking about my life for the first time in years, the more I felt like a cancer on everyone around me. I didn't know how to not be, no matter how much I thought I was trying. I didn't trust myself, so the obvious solution was to disappear. I have an English writing and literature degree, so I made plans to move to Asia to teach. I figured I couldn't hurt anyone from the other side of the world. At my core, I am a deeply boring person. I mostly want to sit around drinking coffee and talking to people about books or the Bronze Age collapse. So the idea of me being brave or adventurous for moving abroad was always kind of funny to me. It was exile. That's all. And a further extension of giving up. See, the great paradox of reaching the point of wanting to disappear from the world is that many of us who have felt that way do so because we think we are a burden or a blight, that we hurt the people around us. The problem, though, is that if you go through with it, you still hurt people, both in the act and in the cleanup of what you necessarily leave behind. As before, I once again thought I was very clever, though. I had a plan. If I disappeared long enough, went far enough, everyone would forget. No one would be left to miss me, and finally, I could go. What I did not count on was my partner at the time coming out with me. As a sign, perhaps, of just how deep-seated my problems were, it didn't even occur to me that I mattered enough for her to want to. Her presence and continued love kept me from actually following through on my disappearing act, at least in totality. So, once again, I very likely owe a dear friend my life. I'm not sure if I've ever actually said that to her in so many words. Guess I have now. She did eventually leave, but by that time I'd established a kind of penitent existence, helping my students and otherwise keeping to myself. I made my peace to some extent with the idea that I would be alone. I still felt wrong. I still hated how I felt and what my body was doing, but I had it safely contained. I wasn't hurting anyone else, was the reasoning, and that would have to be good enough. I was miserable, but I had reached an unhappy sort of acceptance, and as far as I could tell, had been largely forgotten, just as I'd hoped. This went on for 6 years. The funny thing is that, in part, this was brought to an end by my actually getting healthy. I stopped drinking, I got into pretty good shape from rock climbing, and even though I was probably the healthiest I had ever been, I still felt acutely wrong. But now this seemed so much more clearly disconnected from reality. Being healthy and more at peace, along with some other events, finally gave me the mental space to ask the question I had been avoiding my entire life. The moment I allowed myself to consider the question, I found that I already knew the answer, and that I had been trying to tell myself that answer for a very, very long time. I am incalculably fortunate. This story is definitely not me looking for pity or anything of the like. I'm happy. I'm truly happy for the first time since I was a child. And I have a loving and supportive family, friends who I thought forgotten I even existed, who have reached out to talk to me and support me. Some I haven't spoken to in 20 years. I have an online community that's been amazing. I have people in Vietnam, friends at my job, who have all been incredibly supportive from beginning to end. In fact, I haven't had a single negative experience in person, which is wild when I think about what so many other trans people and LGBT people have to put up with. So the reason I wanted to share this again is because inaction is not benign. For a trans person, the inability to explore or question their identity, an inability to even understand what might be happening, is devastating. Yes, we can survive without gender-affirming care. We can survive without even necessarily understanding. But it's certainly hard for me to argue that I was living. And my experience wasn't even the result of bigotry. It was the result of ignorance. It's important to talk about these experiences and to not stay silent, precisely so that no one else has to live through what I did. Still, despite all of this, I get to end on a happy note, right? I have a lot of challenges ahead, I know. Not the least of which is trying to remember how to be social again after spending a half decade, or really close to a decade at this point, as a hermit. But I can honestly say that these are challenges I'm excited to meet. However much time I lost, it could have ended a few times. Or I could have never figured this out at all and gone the rest of my life in that gray misery that I had been stewing in for so long. So really, in the end, I am grateful to everyone and to probably a lot of you who are watching this. And I'm excited for what's ahead. So thank you for joining me on this. Thank you for putting up with the terrible chickens who just never shut up outside of my window. And yeah, I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's something that I hope it helps you understand perhaps a little bit better what it's like to go through this, right? Obviously, none of us can fully understand each other's experiences, but I hope to some degree that this gives you an idea of why giving people space to question and giving people access to this kind of care is so important. So thank you once again, and take care, everyone.